The good news is good news because you have access to a God that will change the way that you see the political world, that will change the way that you vote. When we stop lamenting and crying over the injustices done toward the poor, they become your victims. Amos is like, oh, you excited about God coming? But should you be? You excited about God coming, church, but should you be? It will be darkness and not light. It will be like a man who flees from a lion and is confronted by a bear. It is darkness rather than light, even gloom without brightness in it. Oh, you excited about God coming, but you shouldn't be. You stopped crying over the imbalance of society. You stopped crying over the theft others experience. You stopped crying over the death of your neighbors. You stopped crying over the violence others have experienced. You stopped crying. So, church, you should not be eager for the Lord's coming. Because when you stop crying over the poor and vulnerable and outcast, instead of seeing them as your neighbors, hear me, they became your victims. You see, when we stop lamenting and when we stop crying over the vulnerable and the poor and the outcast, and let me be even more clear about who the vulnerable are in our country. Of course, they are the widows and orphans, even as the Bible tells us. But more particularly in the case of America, they are those with black skin. They are those that identify with the black community. When we stop lamenting and crying over the injustices done toward the poor and the vulnerable and the outcast and the marginalized and the forgotten, instead of seeing them as your neighbors, please hear me, they become your victims. Why do you think George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless other names are no longer with us? Why are they not here with us today? Because America's version of Christianity has made it easy for whiteness to believe that it is more valuable than black life. Now, let me be clear. I've said this to my church several times. And Brian, I'm grateful that you've given me the platform to preach here and to be honest about the way I'm seeing the world and the way that I'm seeing the text, the way that I experience God. I make a big distinction between whiteness and white people. When I say whiteness, I'm talking about the social structure. When I say whiteness, I'm talking about the system that gives privilege and inherent value or says that it has a greater inherent value to those of fair skin in and over black lives. You see, when we stop lamenting, we stop remembering. When we stop remembering, we stop caring. When we stop caring, we go from seeing people as our neighbors and fellow image bearers to making them, whether you know it or not, your victims. See, church, Amos is confronting God's people and say, y'all are excited when you shouldn't be. Y'all have not been living out the love of God that he's poured into you. I love the way Professor Barbara Brown Taylor put it. If you don't know who she is, Google her. Read her books. She's an incredible mind and an incredible soul and has incredible insight.
When we went to the mosque on our field trip and the imam spoke to us ahead of time, he told us he doesn't wish to convert us to Islam. He just wants us to be the best Jews, the best Christians, the best people we can be, regardless of religion. This was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I wish Christianity was this way.
Listen to what Barbara Brown Taylor says. The problem is many of the people in need of saving are in churches. And at least part of what they need saving from is the idea that God sees the world the way that they do. Oh boy. Look at verse 21. He says, I despise your feasts. I can't stand the stench of your solemn assemblies. Now, ironically, the only other time that I've seen God this passionate is when he's talking about his love, right? Consider 1 John chapter 3, where he says, see what great love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children, and so we are. He explodes with emotion there through John. But here he says, I despise your feasts. In other words, your religious duties, your being at church gatherings, the raising of your hands to sing and play to me at your get-togethers, your attempts at repentance, your prayers, they all hella weak. They hella weak. Because you didn't think that my relationship with you to be enough to move you toward impacting the society around you. This is what Brian mentioned just before we jumped into the sermon. He says, you're going to hear those Christians that will tell you, preach the gospel only. Man, just preach the gospel. We need the gospel. And I'm saying, this is it. This is what God is saying, that the good news is. The good news is that you have access to a God through his son that should transform and change all of you. The way that you see the world and the way that you engage with it. That the good news is good for your public life. That the good news is good news because you have access to a God that will change the way that you see the political world, that will change the way that you see your neighbor, that will change the way that you vote, that will change the way that you engage. If your good news is simply good only for your interpersonal relationship, then you've missed at least 2/3 of your faith. The systemic realities that you live in. And the individual, it changes you, it changes your relationships, and it changes the society that you, as an agent of change, lives in. Well, Amos is saying this ain't true worship. In fact, with these verses, Amos is saying that to even suggest that at the heart of authentically following God is not a deep and fundamental concerns with the social ills of your society that we belong to, it stinks. I ain't saying this. This is what the text is saying. He's saying that to even suggest that at the very heart of following God is not a deep and fundamental concern with the social ills of the society that we belong to, it's a stench to God. It stinks.